let me hit record first. Okay. This topic should be cooler than it is, but I think you guys will like this one. Food is obviously one of the best things ever. And you can't tell me otherwise because, food's awesome. Actually found a recipe from when I was a kid the other day of a blueberry soup. And I know that doesn't sound very good, but picture like a nice cold soup with sweet blueberry flavor and a little bit of allspice. Oof, it was delicious. If anyone wants the recipe, happy to send it. But food is an important part of your life. It's not just a part of your social norms, right? Food is a big social thing, but it's also directly tied to health. It's also directly tied to things of like national security. And it's clearly a huge part of business and doing business, right? How many deals in the business world are sealed with dinner and drinks or just drinks, right? So food is clearly important. And we're going to start off with 3 quotes from 2 really important men, and then some arbitrary association of some of the colder states in the United States. And so the first one's from George Washington Carver, arguably one of the best men that has ever existed because he invented peanut butter, and peanut butter is the best. And George Washington Carver, a man of peanuts, said, "In dirt is life." And then arguably one of our best presidents of all time, FDR, right, saw us out of the Great Depression, navigated us through World War II. FDR says, "The nation that destroys its soils destroys itself." And this is coming from a man that lived through the Dust Bowl, right? One of the greatest agricultural disasters of the 20th century, right? So huge problem for the United States that we'll talk about. But again, this is a man that lived through that, saw the horrors of that, and he knows how important soil is. And then our final quote is my favorite quote. I use it all the time. And it's from some arbitrary farm equipment association in Minnesota and South Dakota. Who would have thought, right? They have such an impactful quote, at least. And these people have to say, despite all of our achievements, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And I just love that because no matter how amazing we get technologically, it was all built upon dirt, right? Which is not an accurate way to describe soil because dirt implies a negative connotation, but soil is the bedrock of everything, right? It provides food, which provides for everything else. And, we build on it and all that other stuff. So it's a clearly important thing. And as we saw last class, right, soil is so important. We use it to hide our trash, right? So super important piece of our life is soil. And we're going to talk about soil again and again through this class because it is so important for food. It is so important for our food security, as well as for, well, as a matter of fact, just for everything, right? This quote says it all. We owe everything to that topsoil, the top upper layers of soil that we use to grow food. So let's talk about food. So what we choose for food affects a lot about our bodies, right? You guys know that people that eat healthier foods typically are healthier, right? If you eat fruits and vegetables as opposed to, a 4 for 4 from Wendy's, which is obviously delicious, you're probably healthier, right? And food is more than just your sustenance, right? It provides, as sort of I've mentioned, social aspects, provides family aspects, right? Food is sort of touches every part of your life, and it's a really important thing. And for those guys who've never heard of this gentleman on the right, his name is Ron Finley. He's a gentleman from South Central Los Angeles, and he's been dubbed the Gangsta Gardener. If you've never heard of Ron Finley, he's a pretty cool. I've never met him, obviously, but he's a pretty cool dude from what I read. But basically, he saw a problem of food in South Central Los Angeles, and basically saw that people weren't getting enough nutrition to lack of access of healthy food and their overall low income. And we'll talk about this idea of lack of income and health and lack of access to healthy food, as this sort of the talk goes on. But he saw this problem and he basically repurposed, along with some other people, volunteers, city council member, a bunch of urban gardens in parking strips, vacant lots, schoolyards, and homeless shelters where he teaches people how to grow foods and prepare local healthy meals for themselves. So trying to provide access to food that, and bring, sort of the importance of soil and the importance of growing food into the urban environment. Because I think, when you sort of live in an urban or suburban environment for long enough, or maybe forever, if you're born in the city and you've always lived in the city, the importance of soil, the importance of growing food is really lost if you don't see it. And Ron Finley here does a great job of sort of showing the importance of how to grow food, why growing food's important, and sort of what goes into it, and how, sort of why we should think about how our food is grown. And you'll see why that is in just a moment. And you probably also know why it's important to know how your food is grown, but I won't spoil things yet. Now, we talked about domestication, and domestication, remember, is one of the most powerful forces on the planet, right? It takes corn from teosinte and brings us modern corn, more nutritious, more bushels of corn per acre, larger corn, more calories per corn. So it takes foods that would take, essentially, to produce enough food to feed a group of people would maybe take hundreds of hectares, right? Several hundred acres of land, but we can do the same with our modern domesticated corn in a fraction of that land size. So domestication is super duper important for the way we grow food. But the other thing domestication sort of piggybacks on is our technological prowess, right? Humans are amazing at making tools, right? And that's something we really don't share with very many animals on this planet. And our overall tool making capacity, whether it's something as simple as a plow that you pull through a field, whether it's fertilizers, whether it's learning that you should use organic decaying plant matter or animal feces to fertilize your crops 6,000 years ago, or whether it's knowing better to build to plant your crops closer to a river where you can properly irrigate them from, say, the Nile River, right? And so our agricultural prowess, again, domestication is part of it. But remember, technology is such an important part of it. And that's always a hallmark of the Anthropocene, right? Our capacity to grow food, allow us to settle down, and allow us to grow more food per acre. And there's sort of awesome stories spread throughout history, whether it's the Native Americans here in the United States, right, enriching their soil with fish, and doing what we call companion planting, where they'll pair two plants together because it's better for the soil, and all sorts of things throughout. Our history, including tractors and fossil fuel use, have really fueled our agricultural practices and shaped them into what we see in the modern practice. Because remember, we all owe everything to this beautiful brown stuff that we walk on. Now, the modern agricultural practices really kicked into gear in the 1900s, and people have called it the Green Revolution, but I don't like that term. A lot of people don't like that term because typically when you hear green revolution, you think about like clean energy and clean technology. But the modern agricultural practice, as we've sort of talked, has been anything but that, right? As we saw with the climate change lecture, the dirtiness and the energy intensiveness of our modern agriculture is anything but green. So I don't like the green revolution, but that's what it's called historically. So it is what it is. And the reality is the Green Revolution and our massive expansion, using gas and diesel powered plows and tractor, reducing overall cultivation time, basically allowed us to, in essentially 40 years, to triple our averaging grain yields, upwards of 6 metric tons per hectare of land, which is, in contrast to sort of what we used to do, is absolutely astronomically high. If people in the 1700s could grow 6 metric tons of corn or soybeans or whatever per hectare, they'd be super happy. But now we just kind of take it for granted, right? This is just how modern agricultural practices work. So let's talk about some of these modern agricultural practices. What do they look like? Well, there's a lot of aspects that go into what we do normally. Now, one of the big things is actually irrigation, watering. Now, I don't need to tell you guys, everything on the planet needs water, right? And the way I always sort of make this analogy to people is that, like, when you look at NASA, when they're looking for life on other planets, or they're looking at Mars or something like that, anytime they see evidence of water, they get super excited. And why is that? Well, everything that we know of needs water. So where there is water, there is life. So NASA gets all giddy when they think there's water somewhere, as you would expect, as a bunch of NASA nerds would do, right? And I say NASA nerds with all due respect to the people at NASA, because I'm just a microbiology nerd and they're just space nerds, so that's okay. Now, globally, we irrigate a lot. We use, depending on the country, between 30 to 70% of all water usage across the planet is dedicated to the irrigation of our crops. Now, this is fresh water. We use a huge proportion of our fresh water, depending on where you are, to irrigate crops. Now, clearly we have to irrigate our crops. That's not a problem, right? Adding water to crops, they grow and they need it, right? But the way at which we irrigate is remarkably different than the way we used to irrigate. Now, clearly rain is a part of growing things, in the past, and rain is still a part of the way we grow things nowadays. But the way we grow things nowadays, we set up our farms in such a way that we can mechanically water them on a daily basis. And the reality is, we have all this technology of pumps and ways to tap into aquifers underground, these long distance canals and automated sprinkler systems, to the point where we essentially overwater our plants. And I don't mean overwater like you accidentally overwatered, your orchid at your house and you killed your orchid, right? I mean just like too much water for what the plant needs, right? It's like, I could go to Chipotle and get a burrito bowl, but I could also eat 2 burrito bowls, right? And so that 2 burrito bowls at Chipotle is way too much. And that's kind of what we do with our modern irrigation system. It's just too much for what the plants actually need. Now, paired with our watering, we apply 2 key things. Now, it's synthetic fertilizers is the first. And don't get me wrong, synthetic fertilizers are super important. You add more fertilizer, which is principally nitrogen. Most plants need a lot of nitrogen to grow. There's also phosphorus in there as well. So those are sort of the 2 key elements that plants need. And they're great. The reality is, we actually know for a fact you add a lot of fertilizer, any fertilizer, to plants, and they grow better. And that's just the way it is. More fertilizer means more growth. It's kind of a cool thing. However, the amount at which we use fertilizers has increased dramatically. So in 1950, we used about 14 million tons of fertilizers here in the United States. Modern times, we're close to 200 million tons now. And that's, if you sort of put that in perspective of how much fertilizer that is, 200 million tons is a lot of fertilizer, like a lot. So that's one thing we add to our fields, makes our fields grow better. Now, the other thing we add is pesticides and herbicides. So pesticides kill insects, spiders, things, creepy crawlies of the world, the awesome things of the world, at least in my opinion. And we also add herbicides, which kills weeds. Now, weeds are bad for a couple reasons, for farmers at least. They don't want to pick them up when they're harvesting their plants. They don't want like a gypsum weed, which is toxic, to get into their corn or their soybeans or something like that. They worry about that. But they also worry about weeds killing their crops. And so pesticides and herbicides are used globally, but about 30%, about 30% of all pesticides globally used are actually used in the United States all by itself. So the United States loves fertilizer. We love pesticides, and they make agriculture easier, right? If you don't have to worry about pests because you apply lots of pesticides, makes your life easier. Now, another piece of technology that we like to use in modern agriculture, which we haven't talked about yet, is essentially the extra take on this topic of domestication, right? Targeted changes in plants. And that's what we call genetically modified organisms. There are lots and lots of genetically modified organisms across the planet. They are always a controversy ever since they were introduced in the 70s. In the 70s, they were doing things not very targeted. They were doing random mutations to plants to try to get new traits. And then as the technology sort of progressed into the 90s, into modern times, we do much more targeted editing to plants. So doing things like putting vitamin A genes in rice to create golden rice, or to create what we call BT corn, which has a toxis from a bacteria. Its initials are BT. Unironically, that basically means it's you can apply a special type of pesticide to it and the plant doesn't get hurt by it. I'm sorry, a herbicide, I should say. And so genetic manipulation is pretty dang important. Genetic manipulation allows us to, say, use different types of fertilizers. It allows us to grow more food, allows our plants to be more drought tolerant, more tolerant to salt, any number of things you can think of. Genetic manipulation has some level of solution to. Now, people, as I've sort of mentioned, have been up in arms about genetic manipulation. They don't see it as natural, but scientists argue we've been doing this for a long time, right? And I'm going to go back to the picture of teosinte. This is what natural corn looks like. This is what we've done to corn. The difference is this was done through breeding. what we do to corn now is just a targeted version of adding genes. So there are really two sides to the same coin. And there are lots of people that are concerned, including most of the EU, about the safety of genetically modified organisms. But as far as we know, all the science, and this is not like a few studies, there's many, many studies that show that GMOs are safe. They're not going to change they're not going to change your hormones. They're not going to change your DNA or anything like that. GMOs, as we know of today, are safe. So that's where we're at, but they are important. They serve an important role, and I can guarantee you, with the sort of difficulties that are being posed by climate change in the future and now, for just a matter of fact, this is going to become a more important thing. So you can expect to see more GMOs going forward. And I personally wouldn't worry about it, but I do know people do worry about it. So that's our technology. Now, how does modern agriculture impact the environment? So that's going to be the next question we're going to ask. And we're talking about this in environmental science and sustainability course. So clearly it's not in a positive way. And you'd be absolutely right about that. The way we grow agriculture is not healthy for the planet. We have lots of inputs: fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, excess water. This has dramatic environmental impacts, and many of which we don't understand. And that's the reality of it. Now, one of the things that we see is as we add more and more water, we actually start to, I should say, not just a lot of water, but we also start to heavily cultivate an area. We actually start to do what's called soil erosion, where basically the wind and water actually start to strip away our very important topsoil. And so just to put this in perspective, the American Midwest, so where we grow the bulk of our food in this country, with not factoring California, of course, they've lost about 6 feet of topsoil due to erosion, due to the modern agricultural practices within the last 50 years alone. It's a good thing they had like 12 feet of topsoil, but that's what our practices do. We degrade our soils. And one of the things that happens as we let our soils become more and more degraded and more erosion sets in, we start to see scenes like this. Now, this is a picture from China where they're having a dust bowl from modern agricultural practices. But remember, in the 1920s, we had the same exact problem. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people had difficulty with this huge bowl of dust because of how poorly we treat our soils, led to people starving, led to, at least part of the reason we had the Great Depression, and so on and so forth. So modern agriculture is not good to the health of our soil. It increases erosion and makes things like the Dust Bowl, or a Chinese Dust Bowl, as we see here, far more common. But overall, soil degradation and loss is a big deal. Globally, we lose about 360,000 hectares of land, of soil, every year to desertification, so soils becoming deserts, or simply just erosion. And that is a scary thought because, again, we owe so much of our society to our health of our soil. Now, as we start to lose our soils as well, we start to lose their capacity to fight climate change. Our soils are an important reservoir for storage of carbon dioxide as dead things. And so as our soils go, we add more and more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Now, we're also seeing a couple other things. We're seeing leaching, which is basically seeing the loss of minerals and other things either deeper into the soil or into our waterways. We're also seeing the leaching of our fertilizers and pesticides into our waterways as well. And we're also seeing an increase in salinization because as we start to lose soils, salt, which is naturally present in soils, I know that sounds kind of weird to think about, but salt is naturally found in soils. It starts to build up. And as you guys probably know, you can't grow crops in salty soil, right? Salt is bad for plants. And so let's look at the map. Let's look at a map of what soil degradation looks like. So we have soil without vegetation. It's mostly the deserts, right? We have the Gobi Desert, we have the Sahara, we have Greenland, which is basically a giant desert covered in ice, our American Southwest, and so on and so forth, the Atacama Desert. And then we have stable soils are this yellowy color. You'll notice that there's not much left of them, right? There's some in Central and South America. Most of it's in the Arctic, really cold areas, some in India, and then a little bit in Australia, but there's not a lot of stable soil left. Degraded soil is by far the most common, and it covers most of the planet, as you can sort of see, right? Most of North America, most of Africa, most of Asia, and so on and so forth. And then we have the red guy, which is very degraded soil, and that's probably the third most common thing. But again, it's spread across some really important areas of the world. And principally, we're thinking about sub-Saharan Africa, which already has problems growing enough food. India, which has and China, which both have, collectively about what we'll say 2/6 of the world's population. And then we have our breadbasket, right? Midwest United States, our friends over in California. So lots of places that grow lots of food for lots of people have very degraded soils. And the reality is this is strictly because of our activity, the way modern agricultural systems treat soil. Too much water, too much inputs, too much tilling of your soil, not enough variety of crops, which we'll discuss in a few slides, leads to the degradation of your soil. And the reality is soils can be restored, don't get me wrong. However, it's not particularly easy to do, nor is something a farmer would be able to do. So we're losing soils, and the other part of agriculture, well, one of the other parts I should say, is our water. Now, as we talked about, water quality is impacted by human activities, but it's also impacted by agricultural activities. Now, one of the big issues, and we touched upon it a little bit in our water class, is actually what happens when we have too much suspended solids. So as I mentioned, the more and more water we add to our agricultural systems, the more likely we are to strip soil away, and that soil has to go somewhere, and it ends up inside of our waterways, eventually make it to the ocean, right? But when when soil gets trapped in water, it simply is called sediment, just as a note. And that might not seem like a big deal, but the reality is cloudy waters are bad for aquatic plants and aquatic species. So our waterways are being choked by sediment from our agricultural fields. And it does eventually settle, and that can potentially smother aquatic life and basically change the hydrology of areas, which is not a particularly good thing either. Now, that's water quality. There is one other aspect of water quality is our fertilizers. This is a pretty cool one. And so fertilizers, as I mentioned, are added in droves to our fields, and they have to, the reality of adding fertilizers is only about 30% or so, depending on who you ask. Only about 30% actually gets absorbed by our crops. The rest of that fertilizer either hangs around in the soil or gets washed out into our waterways. And nitrogen, and which is a key component of fertilizer, is just one classification of what we call an organic water pollutant. And so I like this little map from the World Bank. It looks the same. This is from 2004, but it's the same map today. I just was too lazy to update it because it's the same thing. But you can see we have water pollutants in kilograms per day, and you'll notice that China and the United States, unsurprisingly, lead the way in organic water pollutants because partially due to our agricultural practices. That's the word I was looking for. And then tied directly with that is actually this other map, which is from our friends at NOAA. And this actually looks at what we call oceanic dead zones. Now, oceanic dead zones are one of my favorite topics to study. It's one of the things I worked on in grad school because it's a microbial process. And so what happens when all that fertilizer gets washed out of our agricultural fields and into our waterways, it eventually gets to the ocean. Now, the reality is all the plankton and algae in coastal ocean waters, so say here in the Gulf of Mexico, they all lack enough nitrogen to grow. And so they're what we would call limited by nitrogen. If we add a lot of nitrogen, because say the Mississippi River is dumping tons and tons of it every day during the growing season into the Gulf of Mexico, well, those plankton and algae, they're going to say, ooh, there's all this nitrogen. I can start to grow crazy, and I can start to divide and grow and reproduce like crazy. And that's what they do. They go crazy. But as I mentioned, we only add fertilizers during the growing season. So eventually that spigot of fertilizer turns off, and they're basically left with not enough fertilizers to support their growth. So all these algae and all these plankton populations simply die off. But as we mentioned in the last class, nothing goes to waste in nature. So when an algae and plankton die off, something eats them. And that thing is bacteria. So the bacteria go to town, they start to eat all the dead plankton and all the dead algae. And they actually, when they do that, they consume a lot of oxygen, basically all the oxygen in a given area. And they create what are called oceanic dead zones. which are areas of the ocean which are either hypoxic or anoxic. So hypoxic is less than 4% oxygen. Anoxic is without oxygen completely. And you can imagine, like, if there's a place in the ocean with no oxygen, say like the Gulf of Mexico, anything that lives there that needs oxygen, which is most animals, or I should say all animals, is simply going to die. And so our modern agricultural usage of fertilizers leads to a process of eutrophication, which stimulates algae to go crazy, which eventually die, which then get consumed by bacteria, which then create oxygen-free zones in the ocean, as you can see from this graph, whether it's in California, Europe, China, Australia, anywhere. Again, simply because we added a lot of fertilizer, leading to a complete lack of oxygen in these large areas, causing everything in this area to die. And I mean everything. So like when this happens in the Gulf of Mexico, it kills billions upon billions of animals and shellfish and fish and everything when it happens. So they are really, really destructive, both environmentally and economically, if you rely upon fish or shellfish for monetary value. So oceanic dead zones are a very, very common and very, very prolific aspect of our, not prolific, a very dangerous aspect of our modern use of excess fertilizer. Because remember, our crops only absorb a small percentage of our fertilizer. So most of it, the rest of it has to go somewhere. And remember, everything eventually makes it to the ocean. So the ocean gets another kick in the gut. So that's our friend nitrogen pollution. It's a pretty cool aspect. Now, the other aspect of modern agriculture is how much water we use. As I mentioned, we use more water to irrigate our fields than we probably should, which leads to changes in water availability. Now, we talked about this one, the Agala Aquifer, which spans from South Dakota all the way to Texas, and it's at lows, historic lows right now. But there are aquifers in China. This one's the North China Plain Aquifer. It is also at historic lows. Now, remember, underground water sources, these aquifers, they are replenished very, very slowly. Remember, it's like, you know, every 1,000 years, they're fully replenished with water. So we take and take and take for these things to grow crops or for industry or whatever, and nature simply can't keep up. So aquifers, remember, these are just underground water sources across the planet, are at all-time lows. But that's not the only type of water that's actually in danger. We do know that large waterways, such as the Mississippi River, for instance, or even sometimes people like to talk about the Yellow River in China, is that they're at historic lows. The Mississippi River is at a historic low right now. It's been a historic low for years. It gets, you know, the bar gets lower and lower every year for the Mississippi River. But the reality is the Mississippi River, which runs, you know, over here, you can't really see it on the map, of course, is a result of all the agriculture in this area. As the same thing with the Agala Aquifer, the same thing with the North China Plain Aquifer. Lots and lots of water taking to grow crops, which clearly is an important thing, but the idea is that modern agriculture encourages too much water taking, too much adding of fertilizer, too much adding of pesticides, which brings us to pesticides, which is obviously the perfect transition. Now, pesticides really took off in the 40s, where we started to actually synthesize them in factories. And I love this little piece of propaganda, because that's really what it is. It's not an actual, right? It's just propaganda. And you know, you have a cow and an apple and a dog and a tomato, a potato and a chicken all singing DDT, which is good for me. Now, for those of you that ever heard of DDT, it's one of the most prolifically used pesticides in the history. It was banned in the 70s. Yes, it was banned in the 70s. My little caption here told me. And DDT was a really good pesticide. But like all pesticides, it was super toxic. So DDT being good for these things is not quite true. DDT, if we were exposed to it, our cow was exposed to it, our dog was exposed to it, it would eventually kill us. And we were actually seeing large amounts of DDT accumulations in nature. We were starting seeing DDT accumulations in bald eagles, and other types of predatory birds, leading to overall lesser survival of these birds. Right? We were seeing overuse of pesticides such as DDT that were killing large amounts of insects, killing large amounts of important insects like bees. We actually think that the use of pesticides such as DDT has led to the issue of colony collapse disorder in modern populations of bees that we're observing. If you've never heard of colony collapse disorder, basically just refers to how populations of bees worldwide are declining, principally from the overuse of pesticides like DDT. So pesticides are a big problem, but they are important, right? When we grow crops, we do what's called monocropping, and we'll talk about monocropping in a couple slides, but monocropping basically means we grow one type of food in a given parcel of land. And when you do that, insects love it. When you grow one, say just corn in your backyard, insects say, oh, holy crap, look at all this corn. It's easy to get, let's go to town. And it's not only insects that do that, diseases do that as well. And we'll talk about that later as well. But that pesticide allows you to say, well, go away, insects. You can't eat all my monocrop of corn. And don't get me wrong, pesticides have been really important for growing lots of food. However, again, they're bad for the environment, right? They're bad for you, they're bad for me, they're bad for this happy looking cow. And they're also bad for the farmers. The CDC does estimate that about 20,000 of the 2 million farm workers in the United States suffer from pesticide poisoning each year. Pesticides are organic pollutants. They're very, very hard to treat and recover from. So getting poisoned by this as a farmer is not good at all. And then the final thing pesticides are not good for is that when you add lots and lots of pesticides to any environment, the insects that those pesticides are designed to kill may eventually become resistant to those, which means you're gonna have to find a new pesticide, which means it's probably something more toxic to either humans or the environment. So, well, again, while pesticides are good in terms of letting farmers grow food more easily, there's lots of negative aspects about pesticides. They're designed to kill things, right? And things that are designed to kill things are generally not good, right? Now, GMOs, while not posing any direct health effects on human populations, are an important part of our life. So about 88% of corn and 94% of soybeans grown in the United States are GMOs in some fashion. Now, there's lots of issues around GMOs that are not rooted in detriments to human health. So a couple of these include, and they surround our friends. I'm sorry, I'm not going to say our friends because Monsanto is just an awful corporation, but the corporation of Monsanto, they create what's called Roundup ready crops. Now Roundup, really, really awful pesticide for human health, but really, really effective insecticide. They sell these Roundup ready crops that are genetically modified to be resistant to Roundup. And Roundup as I said pesticide earlier, it's a herbicide, I'm sorry. So they sell these soybeans, these corn that are resistant to Roundup, so farmers can indiscriminately apply Roundup to their fields, get rid of any weeds, making sure their fields are better. Now, that sounds bad, and I would agree that that's not good. But the reality is one of the issues surrounding GMOs is actually the patenting around them. So often, a lot of times our propagules of corn and soybeans will actually be found in fields in places where the farmers did not buy those. And so companies like Monsanto and others, of course, I won't just pick on Monsanto, they'll actually start to legally go after people who accidentally or purposely use their crops without buying them from a corporation. And clearly that's not a good thing if it happens on accident. And it more oftentimes happens to people that are very poor as opposed to very wealthy individuals. And so that's one thing. Now, another aspect of using GMOs in the agriculture setting is actually what happens if the GMOs get out. It's not a huge deal for plants, not like say a GMO fish getting out. But one of the things we actually have been seeing recently is that some of our GMO traits, i.e. being resistant to Roundup or resistant to any, cool insecticide or pesticide, are actually starting to pop up in nature. So our plants in the agricultural setting are breeding with other plants, passing on these genetically modified traits. So again, not really any meaningful detriment to your health, from consuming a GMO, but there are some ethical and environmental issues around their use. And as I said, they're not really going anywhere at this point in time, especially with climate change, because one of the best things you can do with the GMO is actually make a plant require less water. And that's a good thing for climate change and a good thing for modern agriculture as well. Now, another aspect of our agriculture system is agro-biodiversity. And that sounds like a fancy word, but it's not. It's just biodiversity, which we all know, is just how many species do we have? And agro just simply means the agricultural system. So how many species of stuff do we grow in the agricultural system? That's it. Now, I love this figure. This is one of my favorite figures for this class. And it's really cool because you sort of look at history, back in the early 1900s. You see how many different varieties of corn and radishes and peas and so on and so forth that we grow. And this is reflective of not just these 6 plants we're growing. This is reflective of everything. And you see modern times, we grow very little of them. And so the reality is humans rely upon only about 100 different varieties of plants and cultivars of plants for the vast majority of the calories we consume, which is not a good thing. Now, remember, biodiversity is important for lots of things naturally, but in the aspect of the agricultural system, it's a bad thing because, one, as we only use certain varieties of plants, we actually lead to what's called genetic erosion, where we start to lose potentially beneficial traits. So if we maybe only grow this select variety of lettuce because it's really easy to grow, maybe we're losing out upon weed resistance or drought resistance or pathogen resistance in the lettuce varieties we selected against because they weren't easy to grow. And how does this happen? Well, I mean, it's a monetary thing, right? You want to grow lettuce that's easy to grow, right? You want to spend the least amount of effort to sell the most amount of lettuce, right? And so that's what leads to these levels of low agro-biodiversity. Now, the other thing we're actually seeing happen is as we select for more and more distinct, in limited numbers of plants, is we're actually seeing pathogenic organisms, principally bacteria, viruses, and fungi, start to whittle this number down even more and more and more. And so to give you an example of this, back in the 1950s, it was the heyday for bananas. I know, you never thought you would learn about the heyday of bananas, but it existed back in time because the bananas that we were using back in the 50s, they were awesome from what I've been told. My grandma used to tell me how she hated modern bananas because historical bananas were way better. And apparently the bananas pre-1950s tasted way more like vanilla ice cream than our modern bananas do. I think she used to like to say they tasted more like caramelized modern bananas. But a lot of people have described them as tasting like vanilla ice cream, which sounds awesome. Could you imagine eating a fruit that tastes like ice cream? Sounds awesome. However, that reduced, we like that banana so much, we started to grow that in monoculture, as I mentioned, just growing it one type of banana in a field. And because we selected and whittled down the number of bananas we were using, we reduced agro-biodiversity of bananas. And so what happened to our friend the banana is a fungus, a pathogenic fungus called Fusarium. It's Fusarium, if you want to Google it. Came in and just went to town on our monocropped bananas, basically to the point where it drove those bananas to extinction. Well, not fully, but close to it. I mean, they exist as seeds and stuff like that, but basically just wiped out our bananas. And so people are like, holy crap, what are we going to do? We sell bananas. Like, we depend on bananas. What are we going to do? Which is kind of a funny thing to think about, but it's more or less what happened. And they found a species of banana, the modern variety of banana that you see across all supermarkets in the Western world and elsewhere too. And that banana was resistant to that fungal pathogen, Fusarium. But this story is not over, because we have basically Fusarium strikes back. Our modern variety of bananas, while they were resistant to Fusarium, once we introduced this new banana, started to evolve, as all good pathogens do. And so Fusarium is actually on the rise again in banana populations worldwide, and is threatening to push the banana back out the door and force us to find a new variety of banana. So if you like bananas, you should be angry at Fusarium for potentially pushing bananas out the way. And so that's agro-biodiversity. Sorry for the long detour about bananas, but I find it's I find some people like the story. A lot of people don't care, but I like the story quite a bit because it's a really cool way of how agro-biodiversity has changed, why it's changed, and potentially what the consequences are down the line if we don't incorporate more agro-biodiversity. So we've been talking strictly about plants. Now, plants, don't get me wrong, they're awesome, but they're only they're only part of the story, right? A huge amount of people across the globe get either 20 to 50% of their calories on a daily basis from meat, animal flesh, pigs, chickens, cows, fish, mussels, any type of creepy crawly out there. Animal protein in some way, shape, or form is a huge part of people's lives. And in particular, when we think about the United States, our consumption of meat is not only higher than anywhere else in the world on a per capita basis, but it's so heavily ingrained into our culture, right? Think about how much hot dogs and hamburgers are integrated into the American culture, right? Or like how integrated ribs are, or brisket is for Texas, right? Meat is a huge part of society, huge part of our calories, and a huge part of culture as well. So meat does not escape the fate of plants, right? That modern way we grow plants, which we can just simply call industrialization of agriculture, also applies to growing flesh. I know that's a terrible way to think about it, but that's sort of the way it is from an agricultural standpoint, right? Now, since the 1950s, we actually swapped from growing meat in, kind of an easygoing way. Like, you could think of the idyllic scene of a pasture with cows or chickens in that pasture. They're eating, they're roaming free. Pre-1950s, post-1950s, we ushered in probably one of the worst things that has ever happened to agriculture is CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations. Now, we're going to spend a few slides talking about different types of CAFOs out there, but they are, as most of the agriculture we do, awful, not just for the environment, but also for human health, and they're also really bad for the animal welfare of these of what we're eating. So let's talk about CFAOs. But the rise of CFAOs, as you can see, essentially lead to the exponential growth almost of meat production. Right? As you can see, meat production across most of the planet, right, Central, South America, so on and so forth, is just on the rise globally. And meat consumption is on the rise globally as more and more countries adopt a more North American lifestyle, right? American lifestyle. So let's start off by talking to chickens, because chickens, they're my favorite thing to eat. So we'll lead off with them. And now CFOs for chicken basically actually led the entire industry to kick off, right? CFOs for chickens were basically what kicked off the entire culture of CFOs. Well, not culture, but the entire practice of CFOs. Now, when you go to the store and you buy chicken, you go to KFC or Popeyes or Chick-fil-A and you buy chicken, you're getting chicken that's called a broiler chicken. Now, broiler chickens are just regular chickens, but we've done a couple things to them. We've selected for traits that make them produce more breast meat and all sorts of things. But we also enhance them pretty dramatically with protein. So we feed chickens, which typically only eat seeds, animal protein, which probably is not that good for their digestive systems, but that's what we do. And we also chock load them with vitamins, minerals, amino acids. And we took all those chickens, instead of letting them roam over a field, we stuffed a bunch of them into cages. And that's sort of where we're at. And you can sort of see how this has changed. So all these graphs start in 1925 and end in 2012. And I really like these figures because they really show you how effective CFAOs are for the bottom line of chicken production. But you can see for growing time, we've cut that in half from 16 weeks down to 8 weeks. Live weight in pounds up from 2 pounds all the way up to 6 pounds. So basically a tripling of live weight at maturity. We can see a feed efficiency going down, basically cutting in half to about it's pounds of feed per pound of chicken. So basically 2 pounds of feed for a pound of chicken, which is pretty good investment if you're a farmer, of course. And then the final thing is the percent mortality. We're seeing an 18% mortality in the 20s, and now we're down to less than 5% in the 2020s, 2012s, I should say, or 2010s. And so you can imagine, like, this is a really successful thing from I'm trying to grow as much chicken as possible. And you'd be right. Chicken production is easier to do. It's less costly. You make more money off of it. And that's led to the rise of large corporations like Purdue, or you could even say like, for instance, Costco and BJ's are also in that game too, because they sell their rotisserie chickens at $5 a pop. Which is kind of an interesting story. If you've never read that, you should Google why Costco sells their chickens at $5 a pop. It's kind of a cool thing. Actually, it's a really cool thing. You should definitely Google it. And then all sorts of, other corporations that have popped up selling chicken. So it's been great for the industrialization of chicken, but as I'll show you in a moment, it's not been so great for chickens. And then the final thing I'll say, it's actually the way these CFOs are actually really bad for the people who grow chickens. So when you go to the grocery store and you buy, say, from Purdue, that chicken from Purdue is actually just packaged and processed by Purdue, but Purdue bought that chicken from a chicken farmer. And that chicken farmer, if they wanted to sell their chicken from Purdue, had to buy chicken eggs, baby chicks, I should say, from Purdue and grow them a set way with feed from Purdue, and then sell them only back to Purdue at a set price. And that, if that sounds terrible to you, you would be absolutely right. The people that sell chickens to Purdue, they're doing really bad economically as a general rule. Not all of them, but as a general rule, they are. And unfortunately, the people that actually grow chickens and sell them to places like Purdue actually have one of the highest suicide rates in the country because of how essentially awful it is to be in business as a CFO selling to a company like Purdue. So I won't say anything more about that. Purdue's on the list of companies I don't like. So I'm just going to stop talking about Purdue because I'm angry. I don't want to get angry. I want to talk about pigs, and well, I'll probably get more angry again. But let's talk about pigs. And I don't have a picture of what chicken factories look like, but I have a picture of a pork lot. So this is a CFO for cattle, but it looks very much the same for pigs and chicken as well. But chickens are just going to be in cages in a building. But pork production is very much like chicken production. Lots of pigs stuffed in an area, fed crappy food, cheap food, fed lots of hormones and lots of nutrients to make them grow faster and bigger. And we've also adopted and reduced the overall biodiversity of pigs and cows and chickens for that matter, with lots and lots of artificial insemination. So in 1990, just as a matter of statistics, about 70% of all porks were artificially inseminated. But by the 2000, essentially all the pork that you can buy, or all the farms, basically all of the pigs were artificially inseminated, which means that we basically have very, very low genetic diversity of the pigs that we have, which is not a good thing, right? Low genetic diversity is never a good thing, right? Because that means there's low biodiversity, which is always a bad thing. And so very much like our chickens, and very much like we're going to see with our cows also are stuffed into small places. Now, cows are a little bit different than chickens and pigs. You can just grow chickens and pigs in a confined space, but calves, so baby cows, actually have to be raised in traditional grass-covered pastures until they're about 6 months old, and then they're moved into scenarios like this. So cows get a little bit of time, a little bit of vacation, but then they get stuffed into a field like this. Now, these calves, you can technically, these cows, I should say, they're fed a couple different things. Now, they're fed fat and protein from slaughterhouses, so animal byproducts. So cows are naturally, as you guys probably know, they're herbivores, but they are being fed animal parts, which is not good for the digestive system. They're also fed lots of corn and lots of soybeans, which is also not good for the digestive system. And then they're just chock full of vitamins, synthetic estrogen, antibiotics, and what we would call roughage, so just like some straw to help their gut. And they also have actually started to add growth promoters. One in particular is called Zymax, which actually boasts muscle production. And basically, by just giving a single cow Zymax, it actually makes the cow about 30 pounds heavier by the time it's ready for slaughter. And just to sort of put this in perspective, right? They're doing all this to make cows grow faster, to make cows grow bigger, to get more profit, more bang for their buck every time they grow a cow. And so to put this in perspective, in the 1950s, it took about 3 years to raise a single steer for slaughter. But with the modern way we grow things in a CFO, it takes about 14 months, which when you sort of think about what that looks like, you think about how big a cow is born. Baby cows are about 100 pounds, 200 pounds in that ballpark. By the time the cow is ready for harvest, so 14 months later, these cows weigh thousands of pounds. And that's an absolutely crazy thing when you think about it, right? You go in 14 months, you cause an animal to go from a few hundred pounds to several thousand pounds. Cows are huge. And that's just an absolutely crazy thing. And from a business standpoint, it's great. But from a cow standpoint, clearly not that good. So that's sort of the three most common meats we eat. But a huge proportion of the world relies solely on seafood. And seafood is a big part. Now, what sorts of technologies have gone into seafood? Well, there's lots of them, and they're pretty commonly used things: sonar, GPS, 3D mapping, and as well as helicopters, as well as scientific knowledge. Scientists that study where salmon are going to be, right? They study the phenology of salmon, how they develop, where they go. That's all been used to enhance our ability to catch, find, and eventually process and sell large amounts of fish from the aquatic world. So give you some numbers here. Now, since 1950, the global annual fish catch has actually quintupled. It's not a phrase you can you hear quite often, but exceeds 90 million tons of fish per year. And the average seafood catch per capita, so per person, has risen from 15 to 35 pounds. So pretty large increases since the 50s. Again, implying an industrial way of getting food, as opposed to like going out there with a fishing rod and catching food for my family. I'm going out there with monster nets and fancy technology to catch as much fish as possible. And so that's one part of fish, but the other part is seafood farms, right? Aquaculture. And growing lots of fish, like say chicken, in a small confined area, feeding them lots of antibiotics to prevent disease and help them grow, and feeding them a limited set of cheap foods to help them grow faster so they can be killed and then sold for profit. And so that's sort of where we're at. Catching meat ranges from our catching wild animals to growing animals with the least amount of input as possible to grow them faster, to produce them at production, produce them at a point where you can sell them for the most profit with putting the least amount of effort into them. And that shouldn't be surprising. I mean, that's just kind of what man does, right? That's sort of what capitalism invites, right? The easiest, cheapest solution that yields the most profits. So we can ask the question now, is meat production sustainable? And it's a hell no. A hell no. Now, why isn't it sustainable? Well, we've talked about sort of the issues surrounding what it does, right? Air pollution, water pollution, but there are a lot of other issues. Now, CFOs do produce air pollution. They as their sort of cows are doing their thing, and their pigs, they produce lots of organic dust as they kick up soil. They kick up their feces. It gets in the air. It's a public health nightmare. And it's not just like their feces, it's also pesticides, and microscopic organisms and things like that. They produce lots of not so fun dust. Now, the other part of growing livestock, and it's less of a problem with fish, because with fish, when you grow fish in like an aquaculture setting, you can have fish and then move them out of the tank and bring in tilapia, and then tilapia will eat all the poop, because that's what tilapia do. So it's not a huge problem with fish industry, but in the livestock industry, cows, chickens, pork, poop is a huge problem. CFOs generate more than 1 billion tons of manure every year, which, to put that in perspective, is 40 times the mass of human waste processed in the United States every year, which is so much poop. So much poop, right? So where does the poop go? Well, if you remember from last class, poop would be considered a hazardous material, right? It poses a hazard to the environment or human health, right? You can't just smear cow poop on your face. You get sick. Well, you'd likely get sick. Same thing with chicken poop. So what do CFOs do? Well, they do a couple things, and it shouldn't surprise you. One of the things they do is sometimes they'll just release it into the environment. Not a good thing. Sometimes they'll have just giant piles of it laying around. Again, not a good thing. Oftentimes they'll bury it. Not a good thing. Other times they'll sell it, to say for fertilizer or something like that. A much better idea. Or other times they'll just give like surface impoundment, right? Those mini ponds that I mentioned last class, or the class before, one or two, where they just let the poop stay there. And so animal waste is a huge problem, because where there is poop, there's lots of bad things in that poop. And you guys know this, right? CFOs lead to pretty serious outbreaks of lots of things, right? It can be E. coli, it could be salmonella, it could be norovirus. Coronavirus is actually carried by poop as well, just as a note. Any number of pathogens can be carried in animal waste. And so how we deal with animal waste, which is currently not that great, can lead to some really awful cases of food poisoning and sicknesses of people. And that's just a part of it. And there's lots of other issues with disease-wise with animal production as well. But just to give you some numbers, raw foods that have some level of animal origin have 48 million of cases of foodborne illnesses in the United States alone every year. So put that in perspective, that's what 1/7 of the population suffers from foodborne illnesses every year, which is a huge amount of people, right? 48 million cases is a lot for a single type of, well, not a single type, but a single origin of a disease. And of those 48 million, nearly 1% die. And that's bad, right? I don't want to tell you that people dying is bad, but that's a lot of people dying from just the way we handle our food, the way we grow food. So the answer to the question at the title of this slide is no, not at all. The way we grow food is not, right? It's not sustainable because we put way too much inputs and we have way too much waste, and none of that is sustainable, not at all. Now, one of the other things, and this could be a class all on its own because, well, it's me and I love bacteria, is actually what the livestock industry has done to antibiotic resistance. Now, what is antibiotic resistance? Well, antibiotics are natural compounds. Sometimes they can be synthetic. There are synthetic antibiotics out there, but they're most commonly natural compounds that either kill or inhibit the growth of bacteria. So antibiotics only work on bacteria. They don't work on fungus. They don't work on viruses. Just laying that fact down. People ask me why, when you get the cold, why don't you take antibiotics? It's because antibiotics don't work on viruses. So antibiotics, super duper important. Now, they were invented about the time of World War II, and they're credited in World War II alone with saving well over 500,000 soldiers' lives, because antibiotics are really important. They kill pathogens that normally would have killed us or seriously maimed us. And so they're one of the most important inventions of all time. However, I don't know who discovered this. I've never been able to find this information in a way that I would trust. But at some point in time, some farmer somewhere found out that when he fed his cows antibiotics, because they got, say, an infection, that cow that got an antibiotic would grow larger. And I don't mean like a pound larger. It would grow like 20 to 30% larger. And why this is, I have no idea. We don't have any idea why antibiotics stimulate the growth of our livestock. It just does. So again, I don't know why. You can Google it. You'll see lots of speculation as to why it is, but there's no concrete answer at this given time. So you can imagine giving antibiotics to a cow that does not need antibiotics is not a good thing, because as we sort of use an antibiotic, there are bound to be bacteria, as you can sort of see in this example here, that pop up with some level of genetic resistance to that antibiotic, leading to that antibiotic becoming overall not as effective anymore. And so as more and more of the CFOs started using antibiotics, we've seen a pretty stark rise in antibiotic resistance in the clinical setting because of our livestock. And so I'm not a super big fan of Panera. The one thing I like that Panera does, and I'm not a fan of Panera because they got rid of my favorite salad. That's why I don't like Panera. Not that they're bad or anything. They got rid of my favorite salad, which I hate them for. However, one thing Panera does is they have antibiotic-free meat, which I think is an important thing, because the use of antibiotics and the production of meat has led to what scientists have actually called the antibiotic crisis. So right now, we're actually in the middle of an antibiotic crisis. You probably didn't know that, or maybe you've never heard of it, or maybe you heard of it. And it's because of the overuse of antibiotics, partially due to the use of antibiotics in the food growing sector. And so if you want to know a little bit more about the antibiotic crisis, I definitely recommend you take a peek at it. The United Nations has, for the past couple of years, designated antibiotic resistance as one of the largest global threats out there, after things like climate change. So it's a really big global threat. So I definitely recommend taking a peek at it. It's a pretty cool topic. But I'm going to move on because I'll just keep talking about it. Now, what are the impacts of fishing? Because remember, fishing, you can catch wild fish. Well, one of the issues with fish is overcatch. And this is true for pretty much every fishery on the planet. And there's this constant tug of war between governments and the fishermen. You hear about it in Massachusetts and Maine all the time. And what fishermen want to do is they want to go out and catch as many fish as they can. Why? Well, the more fish you have, the more you can sell, the more money you make, right? Buy a better house, right? And that's just kind of the way it's always been, right? If you're a really successful fisherman, you make a lot of money, especially if you say do lobster. Lobster fishermen can be very, very wealthy. Well, not like wealthy like Jeff Bezos wealthy, but like wealthier than your average American. Let's leave it at that. And so if the incentive is to catch more fish to sell for more, you can imagine that leads to overfishing, and you'd be absolutely right. Pretty much every fishery over the entire globe is overfished because we take too much fish. Now, why is that a problem? Well, remember, when we think about how populations grow, right, that sort of logistic growth, they need some level of baseline population to grow. And if you take too much fish, you overfish them, you might push them below that baseline level that they need to grow to replenish their population, which will eventually lead to their overall decline in populations globally. So that's the importance of overfishing. Taking too much means there's not going to be enough for a future population of that animal, which again is not sustainable. And then we have bycatch. And bycatch is remarkable. So we catch fish primarily on long lines or large nets. And as we do primarily the nets, we get lots of bycatch. So we catch things that we didn't mean to catch, like sharks or dolphins or fish that we would never eat. And bycatch is a huge issue. And so you can sort of look at this figure here where you have, where it's Alaska, California, in the Atlantic, where they catch lots and lots of fish, and they discard huge proportions of what they catch, including, this California set gillnet fishery, where they discard 65% of what they catch, more than 30,000 sharks and rays, and they discard them. Now, why do they do that? Well, there's just no market for them, right? You're not going to, it doesn't make sense to catch and keep a shark if no one's going to buy it, right? It just wastes space that you could use to, say, bring salmon in. Right? So bycatch and overfishing are two big problems. It hurts the fishing population that the fishermen are interested in, but also hurts other populations. And so these ones are pretty straightforward, but they do sort of bear some level of explanation. But now, in the agricultural world, obviously the aquaculture world, I should say, there's lots of GMO fish out there. Now, one of the company that does this is a pretty interesting company called AquaBounty. Now, they're trying to their mission, actually, if you sort of look at them, or at least it used to be, I don't, maybe it's not anymore, can't remember. They're one of the first companies to produce a GMO animal for production, and they did it with the salmon. And what they did is they spliced in genetic material from the Pacific salmon and eel-like fish from the North Atlantic that grows really fast to make their farmed salmon bigger and grow faster, so we can stop hurting the wild populations of salmon out there. Because I'm sure you guys probably have heard wild populations of salmon are doing really bad, like really, really bad, as are most fish, as I mentioned. And so they're trying to solve that problem by getting farmed salmon that grow faster and try to solve that problem with genetic engineering. So unlike plants, which you don't have to worry about a plant escaping, you have to worry about fish escaping, because escaped fish are a big deal in aquaculture. And if these, what people have called frankenfish, which I don't think is an appropriate term, but that's what they call it, if they do escape, it might potentially lead to a decimation of natural populations of salmon. So, and this is one case where I would argue genetic engineering, while it has noble intentions, is probably not the most effective thing due to the high probability of this, again, frankenfish in quotations, making it out and harming local salmon biodiversity. So that's our GMO fish. They're pretty cool, scientifically, of course, but lots and lots of ethical issues surrounding the way we grow food, right? Everything we sort of touched upon today, there's ethical issues posed to the environment and ethical issues posed to human populations. So our modern food system has done no favors. It's produced lots of food. It's made lots of people lots of money, but it's put lots of issues forth that we're not really addressing right now, unfortunately. So how has our food system changed? How has food changed our planet? Well, the reality is our planet is radically transformed. Croplands and pastures cover about 40% of all the land on the planet Earth. It's the largest single terrestrial biome. And think about what that means. Like the Arctic, which covers, close to 15 to 20% of the planet. There's more cropland, more pasture land in the Arctic, which is crazy when you think about it, right? Picture most of Asia. That's how much farmland there is on this planet. It's huge. And that's not to be unexpected, right? There's 7.5 billion of us. And some of us don't get enough food, and some of us eat way too much food. And so there's a huge necessity to grow more food. And as we sort of grow more food, as we sort of expand industrial agriculture across the planet, we're actually decreasing the amount of and the variety of food, sorry, there's just the variety of food, not the amount of food, the variety of foods were growing. And so about 60% of all human calories across the planet are derived from just rice, corn, and wheat. And that's crazy. To me, it's crazy. That's a lot of calories from the entire planet to be derived from 3 plants. Crazy. So what, given this increasing scale, what has this done to production of food? Now, clearly production of food has gone up, but this has also led to a decline of diversity of the foods we eat. So over the past 100 years, there's been about a 90% decline in the varieties of foods, as I've sort of already mentioned. Now, as our food sources decline in diversity, as I mentioned with the banana, this leads to potential issues with food security. What happens if populations of corn globally start to face, or populations of wheat or populations of rice start to face a serious fungal pathogen or a serious viral pathogen? What happens then? And it really does threaten our food security, given how little variety of crops and how much of our caloric intake on a daily basis is dependent solely on 3 crops. And that's sort of always kind of a crazy thing when you sort of think about it, right? Like how much world security is dependent upon our capacity to produce 3 single crops, right? If those 3 crops disappeared, 60% of plant calories of humans are gone. And not to mention all of our calories that depend on feeding cows and chickens, wheat and corn also disappear as well. So just picture how important those 3 crops are to diversity. Now, in addition, we're actually seeing not just food insecurity, about 2 billion people on this planet are food insecure on a daily basis. There's also the sort of the darker side of that, or I guess the opposite side of that, whatever you want to call it, where there's excessive overconsumption. Right? And we're seeing a greater focus put on processed foods. So less eating of vegetables, but processing those vegetables or processing fruits or whatever, as opposed to just eating raw goods. And oftentimes what that does is removes fibers, which are a really important part of the human digestive system, but it also replaces them with things like sweeteners, artificial or natural, salt, fats, color, things that could potentially induce allergies. And we're seeing a huge shift in the way we are eating globally. It's not just here. Everyone likes to poke on the United States for being chubby, but it is a shift we're seeing globally, and it's certainly been quite the shift here in the United States. And this does lead to pretty severe shifts in human diets. And so just give you some numbers, compared to about 100 years ago, the average American eats about 60% more sugar, double the amount of fat, and about 3.5 times the amount of salt. So our diets have radically shifted, as not just our agricultural systems have shifted, but also the way we process our agricultural goods has shifted, which has clearly led to serious problems of overnourishment, i.e. leading to obesity. And you can sort of see this in this figure, which I also really like. It's from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, where you can see the size of a burger 20 years ago, or the size of pizza, or the size of a muffin is essentially doubled, right? Going from 300 calories to 600, 500, 800. It's just expanding large and much more rapidly. And when you go to places, people expect large proportions when you go out for dinner, right? And that's just the reality of our modern processing system, right? We encourage overnourishment, overconsumption, but that's really not to be that surprising, right? I mean, modern agriculture encourages overconsumption of raw goods anyways. And in addition to overconsumption, we're seeing pretty strong shifts in food culture. We're seeing a huge rise in sweet and fatty foods, and they're significantly more cheaper. Now, we'll talk about why they're more cheaper in a few slides, but they're ready for consumption. And I like this graph as well because it looks at the percentage of meals eaten at home here in this blue line, food eaten away from home. And this is not like I brought food from my home to eat at my job or at the park. This is like I went and bought food from a store. And you can see from the 87 to 2017, we basically hit the cusp of 50%, and food away from home has overtaken food eaten at home, meaning we're eating out more, eating more processed foods. And part of that is just shifts in people's lifestyles, right? People are more in urban life, working more in urban environments, which means these things are way more accessible, right? It's easier to go to Wendy's if you live in Boston than it is if you live in the middle of nowhere in Western Massachusetts, right? And we're also seeing this not just in like Wendy's and McDonald's and cool places like that. We're seeing it in supermarkets, right? They have much cheaper processed foods. You guys know that it's way cheaper to go to go to Stop and Shop or Shaw's or wherever you buy your groceries when you're around here to buy, processed food than it is to say buy a nice, all the ingredients for a salad and then make your salad for yourself, right? So our processed foods are ingrained into our cultures. Now, how does this link to sustainability? Right? Clearly, modern agriculture is not sustainable. We've already established that, but how do your food choices influence sustainability? The reality is the most sustainable types of food are eating raw vegetables, right? Raw fruits, raw nuts, things like that. That's the most sustainable thing, right? And shifting more away from a conventional, meat diet, right? Eating less meat is more sustainable. Now, why is it more sustainable? Well, I'll show you a little diagram here in a second, but just know the inputs for meat are way higher than the inputs for plants. And in addition to sort of these linkage of your food choices sustainability, we're starting to, I'll just highlight two guys that I think are pretty cool. The first is Jamie Oliver. He actually has a show called, is a show, I don't remember what it's called. I didn't put the name, shoot. It's based on a food revolution to promote healthier diets, i.e. being more sustainable. A healthier diet is actually just strictly linked to sustainability, which is kind of a cool thing. And then the food writer, Mark Bittman, he's a pretty good food writer, if you've never heard of him before. He actually has a food ethical sort of panel that focuses on reducing meat consumption and doing it by highlighting environmental impacts. So why is eating meat a bad thing? Well, we talked about one of the reasons in the climate change lecture. Remember, cows produce an immense amount of methane, and for every methane molecule a cow produces, remember, it's equal to about 15 molecules. I'm sorry, 15. I'm thinking about 5 molecules or so of carbon dioxide. So methane from cows is a bad thing. And eating plants, you get around that, right? And how do you get around that? Well, when you think about people eating just plants, eating low on the food chain, the amount of energy taken to produce all this food, right, has some level of energy investment, right? It's got pesticides, it's got water and energy and all that stuff. And it translates to a bigger piece of energy being transferred to us. When we think about all the energy required to produce this food, which is then fed to cows, only a small amount of that energy from a cow's eventually makes it to humans. So it takes a lot of energy to grow a cow, which means all those inputs, that make our agriculture system bad, are increased, but we end up getting less out of it. Now, so the takeaway from this is eating lower on the food chain is typically better because it's better for the environment from a sustainability point of view. It's also better from a climate change point of view. And the sort of the final thing I'll make mention of is, and people ask me this, obviously none of you have asked me it, but some of you might be thinking of it. Well, how does eating lower on the food chain relate to, say, organic versus non-organic? And I'll get to that in just a moment. Don't you worry. Now, another aspect of the way we eat our food is animal welfare. We can see animal welfare takes a pretty big shine nowadays. It's a bigger concern for more people across the planet, but we are killing more animals for food than at any time in our history. And the way we do it is through CFOs, right? Through putting way too many cows, right? Sometimes hundreds and thousands of cows in an area where there should only be a few cows. Cows need a lot of room. And so this leads to all sorts of ethical issues surrounding the way we grow not just our agricultural products, but also our animals. And so the welfare of our animals, they get more sick and they get stressed out. The animal welfare in CFOs is not good, to put it mildly. And we've seen popping up of many groups surrounding animal welfare, and they're becoming more common. It was one of the original groups was PETA. I'm sure you guys probably know PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. PETA sucks from an environmental standpoint and from an ethical standpoint. Just as a note, just saying, PETA is not a good organization. So there's many good ones, but PETA is not one of them. So just as a note. So ethical issues, there's energy efficiency issues, but let's talk about organic and sustainable practices. We've seen that the organic industry has grown dramatically. Look at the rise of Whole Foods, right? Whole Foods as a supermarket chain, even before Amazon bought them, was taking off like crazy. And so the desire for organic things is on the rise, and it's a very lucrative industry. You guys probably know organic food is more expensive. Now, why is it more expensive? Well, they have less inputs, right? They use less they don't use well, it depends on the farmer. They use less or no fertilizer. They don't use pesticides. They don't use GMOs typically. So they have less inputs, but that means they get less materials out the back end. So they typically don't produce as much food per acreage as conventional CFO farming. Or not CFO, but conventional farming. And so they have to sell at a higher price, because if they can only grow 100 bushels per acre and conventional farming can grow 500 bushels per acre, they have to meet the costs, right? Because, you know, tending an acre of land costs the same amount of money if it's a small, even if you get a lot or a little from it. And so these ways of organic food is because it has less inputs, it is better for the environment. So organic food is 100% more sustainable. I don't mean that like as a quantitative measure. I just mean it's absolutely more sustainable than conventional farming. But there are sort of two things that organic farming I need to mention. The first is this really cool study. If you're interested in it, I can send it to you. That organic farms that actually use organic fertilizer, so from plants and animal matter, so poop, actually have the same agricultural yields as those that use synthetic fertilizers. So we could technically use poop and organic material to get the same effect as a synthetic fertilizer, which means the process of oceanic dead zones, which we talked about, could be avoided, which is a good thing. But the other thing is actually, because organic foods typically aren't using large amounts of organic fertilizers or anything like that, to grow 500 bushels of corn requires essentially way more space if you do it organic versus conventionally with fertilizers and all that stuff. And so from a climate change perspective, organic farming actually proves to be the worse off solution for climate change. Now, why is that? Well, again, as we grow things, even organically, we use more soil. And as we use more and more soil, we release more carbon dioxide, which means the greenhouse gas budget of an organic field is typically higher when you compare on a yield basis, because organic farming simply requires more land to grow the same amount of food. So those are two concerns to think about with organic farming. They can be really fruitful if you use lots of inputs of organic fertilizers, but if you don't, from a climate change perspective, it's not very good. Now, one other aspect of food is actually this sort of thing of both buying locally and fair trade. You guys probably have all been to Starbucks, and you'll see Starbucks has fair trade certified coffee. Now, what does that mean? Well, fair trade basically is a certification which basically assures that large companies in, say, the United States don't rip off lower income places in, say, Central and South America or Africa, and they do it with the promise of not ripping them off, but also not destroying their environment. And so fair trade is a pretty cool thing. It helps protect income equality in countries in Africa and Central and South America and elsewhere. And it essentially sort of pushes back against the sort of more destructive practices of the modern agricultural world. But the other thing is actually local buying is actually a cool thing, because most grocery stores, so for instance, I live near a Big Y, it's just a supermarket chain here in the Northeast, and they sell, in their section, they sell mostly fruits and vegetables from local farms. And so local farms are pretty important to not only to the local economy, but they're also important for making agriculture more sustainable. Because if you can go down the street and get a bunch of tomatoes, it's better for the environment, it's more sustainable, it's better for climate change than getting tomatoes from Central or South America, right? As opposed to flying them several thousand miles. And then the final thing I'll mention is equity. One of the ways the United Nations knows how to increase equity in terms of like financial equity in countries is actually to promote local and sustainable agriculture. One of the best ways to bring a town out of poverty and to also lift women up as well is to actually do more sustainable local farming. It's one of the best ways to sort of solidify an economic system in a struggling part of the world. So farming can be important for a lot of things. Now, as I mentioned in the climate change lecture, if we summed up all the greenhouse gases produced by food waste, it would be the third largest country. So food waste is clearly a huge problem, not just for climate change, but for also how unsustainable agriculture is. Now, in the United States alone, more than 60% of our food waste occurs simply because we buy food that's either too much food or we simply don't end up eating and we just simply throw away. And that price tag adds up to the American consumer, not to large corporations, but just to you and me and your parents, right? At 165 billion bucks a year, which is a lot of cash, right? Thousands of dollars per person per year. So we waste a lot of food, we waste a lot of money, but because we waste so much food, we produce a lot of greenhouse gases and we increase agriculture intensity, which is obviously a bad thing. So food waste is a big concern. The more food you waste, the more intensive agriculture has to be to meet those food issues. And the final thing I'll say is we waste so much food across the planet is that when you sort of add it up, if we didn't waste as much food as we did, no one on the planet would suffer from malnutrition at all. That's how much food we waste. All the food that the 5 billion of us that aren't malnourished waste could go to feed all the 2 billion malnourished people on this planet. And so it's a staggering amount of food waste, which probably shouldn't be surprising given how much climate change inducing gases food waste produces. So this brings us back to soil, right? Soil is where we grow our food, and it's taken a beating. Agriculture practices have put our soils almost to the brink of collapse. And that's, I'm not thinking just about like Dust Bowl-like scenarios. I'm just thinking about the point where we damage our soils too much, where they're simply not viable enough to grow meaningful amounts of food without large inputs of, say, fresh soil or fertilizers or what have you. And so there's been a big push globally to switch to what we call conservation agriculture, essentially trying to minimize the amount of impact we have on our soils. So using organic fertilizers as opposed to synthetic fertilizers. Organic fertilizers are much better for the soil because the microbes in the soil are used to organic fertilizers. They're used to dead plant material, dead animal material to recycle, give nutrients to the plants and make the plants grow better. That's what nature naturally does. Because remember, when things die, there's no waste in nature. That's opposed to synthetic fertilizers, which either get washed away in a small proportion to get taken up by the plant, but the soil microbes, they don't like them that very much. They just don't. And so soils that are fed synthetic fertilizers oftentimes do less well over time, which is again part of the reason why they're being degraded. So there's been huge calls for the way we change our habitats of growing, including things like doing crop rotations. Basically like if I have 4 fields, I grow soybeans in the top left corner, corn in the other one, alfalfa in the other one, and then maybe wheat in the other one, and I just rotate them year after year after year. And so we sort of cycle them, allowing sort of the agricultural intensity of, say, growing wheat or growing corn to essentially relax as we grow alfalfa and the crops that are better for our soil. But also changing fertilizers. Remember, organic fertilizers typically are better than synthetic fertilizers. And the other thing is actually to minimally disturb our soil. One of the things that we love to do is to dig our soil out every year, shuffle the soil around. That's bad for the soil. And we do it because it puts oxygen into the soil, makes the soil basically start to break down nutrients more. It makes the plants overall healthier. So changing the way we grow our food is a way we can help protect our soil, but also potentially restoring our soil, right? Essentially like where we grow food, basically stop growing food there for a couple of years, grow better, healthier plants on these places to restore our fields because they're in trouble right now. And you can, as I sort of always alluded to, if our soils are in trouble, we're in trouble as well. And the final thing I'll make mention about the health of soils and the restoration of soils is actually that we can actually do some pretty dramatic things to climate change by fixing our soils. Most scientists estimate with about a $250 billion investment at the global scale, and by restoring our soils, both agricultural and non-agricultural, we can actually dramatically halt climate change within a few years. So our soils, not just important for our health, but also important for climate change, which is clearly a super duper important thing. Now, so this brings us to the final thing about our talk today, and it's about the economic subsidies we provide our foods and the people who grow our foods. And so it leads us to the question that's been asked time and time again. Why does a salad cost more than a Big Mac? Why is it cheaper to get a #1 at Wendy's than it is to get a salad at Panera? Well, it ties back to the Farm Bill, right? The Farm Bill here in the United States, it's signed every couple of years by Congress. They play games with it because for political reasons or whatever, but it's signed inevitably every year. And this Farm Bill provides tax dollars, federal, i.e. federal subsidies, to farmers in our country. Now, why is that? Well, the reality is growing many of our foods simply aren't financially feasible without subsidies, many types. And without these, our farmers wouldn't be able to economically survive if they didn't get subsidies from the government, which is bad, right? If we can't grow food in the United States, we can't feed our population. So our subsidies have to exist given our current economic climate. But as you can see from this pyramid, they're not distributed evenly. The vast majority of our subsidies go towards things that are not super healthy. Meat and dairy get about 70%. Sugar, oil, starch, and alcohols get about 11%. And then grains, nuts, and legumes, fruits and vegetables, the healthy stuff, get the remainder. So 80% goes to things that are bad for you. Sugars, oils, dairy, meat. And very little goes to things that are healthy to you. And we can sort of look at this in contrast to what the federal nutrition recommendations are. They recommend mostly grains, which gets 13% of the subsidies, but clearly not enough. 9 servings of vegetables, which get basically no subsidies, a smaller amount of protein and very little sugar, salt, and oil. And this very tippity top of the pyramid gets 80% of all farm subsidies, which when we think about why a salad costs more than a Big Mac, it's because the Big Mac gets subsidized like crazy. That meat in your Big Mac, that dairy, the cheese in your Big Mac, and the special sauce, which is mayonnaise, so it's chicken byproducts, and the sugars and oils and starches, and the grains in the bun get subsidized like crazy. So they can sell a super cheap burger, whereas vegetables, which go into your salad at Panera, and fruits and nuts that might also go into your salad, don't get subsidized as much. So they have to sell for a higher price, leading to your salad costing more than your Big Mac. And there's a couple issues with this, right? This is not healthy, right? Subsidizing things that are unhealthy for us and that should only be used sparingly or low amounts in our diet is not good for the United States, right? This subsidies and the way it's done has led to our obesity rate over, eclipsing 20%. So it's not good from a public health standpoint. But the other problem it does is it actually creates nutrition inequality between classes. So the rich, people that are really wealthy or can even say like myself, that can easily afford to go buy a salad or make a salad at home, we live longer. And part of the reason we live longer is, and especially really wealthy people, is we access to healthier foods, because those healthier foods are essentially too costly for someone that, say, makes the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. And so it sort of creates this really big divide between the people who can afford the stuff that should be integral to your diet and the people who can't afford the stuff that's integral to your diet and focus more on the things that are bad for you, like processed foods and things like that. So it creates this equity problem between economic classes, and it also worsens the malnutrition problem. You can imagine if you can only afford something off the dollar menu at McDonald's, you're not getting as much nutrients as you need, right? You're not getting enough fiber, you're not getting enough vitamins, vitamin K and B's and all these sorts of things. So it creates equality problems and worsens malnutrition problems. And that's a bad thing. And so this leads us to our final slide. What can you do? Sort of unlike climate change, there's not a whole lot of policy stuff that we can do. I mean, people have argued that we should put taxes on sodas and sugary and fatty things, and that seems to be successful. So that might be a way to think about shifting, people from eating less of this stuff and and fixing the problem of malnutrition. Another big thing that people argue that we should do, and I think it seems pretty good, is just to invert this pyramid, right? Put nuts and fruits on the bottom with grains and only subsidize very little of meat and dairy and sugar, oil, and starch. Because the reality is a lot of these things are luxury products, right? We don't really need those things. Not as much as we need much more healthy things overall. So those are some of the policy things people have suggested, right? Taxes and shifting our farm subsidies. I can't see it happening anytime soon, to be honest with you, but that's some of the things people suggest. Now, from a personal suggestion, there's sorts of cool things. So Mark Bittman, that writer from the New York Times, has a cool suggestions that can help you eliminate animal-based foods throughout the day. And reduce your overall footprint, because remember, the food you choose impacts your overall not just your climate footprint, but also, your agricultural imprint, right? Reduce, the better foods you choose, right? Choosing up to eat, a salad at Panera's is way more sustainable than eating, say, a burger from McDonald's. There's also all sorts of other things. So, for instance, the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a seafood watch guide to help you make the best choices for sustainable seafood. There's myplate.gov, choosemyplate.gov, I should say, that can help you sort of pick up more sustainable options. But I'm not here to tell you what to do with your diet. This is just, hey, this is the state of things. You choose what you want to do with your diet. But from the most sustainable aspect, more fruits and vegetables, less meat, less dairy. Wasting less food is a huge one. So there's lots of things you can do to be sustainable, but it's really your choice, because I'm not here to tell you what to do, because that's not my job. Right? I'm here to tell you about all the cool science and all the terrible things that growing food and climate change will do. I'm not here to tell you, oh, you got to do this. That's your parents' job. Well, you guys are all adults, so that's your own job now. So anyways, that is going to be it for today's class. I hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit about our food systems. I'm sure many of you probably already knew a lot of the things we're talking about. Many of you are maybe vegetarians for personal reasons or climate reasons or whatever. And so maybe some of this is all excess knowledge and you already knew it, or whatever. So, but I hope you did learn something. Hope you did sort of get you thinking about food, because food is awesome. But as with most things, it's not always the most sustainable thing to do. So I'm going to stop recording right now. And I hope